Welcome to the first episode of The Take. In this episode, I'm going to cover the story of Zambia's debt, particularly on how the country has defaulted on interest payments to its lenders. I have decided to dedicate the very first episode of The Take to the Zambian debt crisis story for various reasons. The first main reason is that I've noted the absence of young African voices when it comes to key and important topics like this one in the media. The other main reason why this story is very important and very close to my heart, and I felt the need to give my perspective on it, is because I'm a proud young African and I'm also a proud Zambian. With heavy reliance on copper export income, Zambia began to struggle financially in the late 70s when the prices of copper fell on the world market drastically. Now, to overcome this deficit, Zambia, along with 33 other African countries, borrowed heavily. Borrowing heavily meant acquiring a series of concessional loans from multilateral institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. Now, attached to these loans were a series of conditionality clauses, such as the infamous Structural Adjustment Programs, known as SAPs. These conditionalities demanded that the borrowing countries strictly implement a series of macro and microeconomic policies. Now, what this meant for Zambia was that Zambia removed subsidies on food staples that millions of Zambians countrywide relied on. This also meant that Zambia, or the Zambian state rather, which was the largest employer of the majority of Zambians in the economy at the time, retrenched a lot of these Zambians. Another aspect of this meant a reduction of wages countrywide. As you would have guessed, this caused massive unrest. Now, briefly, the issue with these conditionalities and structural readjustment programs was that they treated the African context as a monolith, and they imposed a series of policies without an understanding of how they may impact each country across the continent. And the consequences of these policies were tremendously dire. From the decline of copper prices to Zambia accumulating a lot of debt in the 80s and 70s, the nation really struggled financially until debt relief was announced in the early 2000s. But it was not automatically granted. To qualify for debt relief, a nation had to demonstrate quality financial management. For Zambia, this meant the country had to privatize a lot of industries and organizations that it owned and controlled. And another aspect that a country needed to demonstrate in order to qualify for debt relief was to drastically reduce public spending. After debt relief was finally granted to Zambia, the nation demonstrated sustained economic growth. But about 15 years later, Zambia is back in the same predicament. In November 2020, the Zambian government announced that it was defaulting on interest payments to its lenders. So the real question is, what happened? Now, to answer that, I'm going to list four main key reasons why Zambia is back in that same predicament. The first is learning from the past. George Santayana, in his 1905 book, The Life of Reason, argues that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Now, you'd think that a nation that went through this exact predicament in the decades between 1970 and the early 2000s would have learnt from that unfortunate past and strategically put policies and regulations in place so that it doesn't end up in the same predicament. But clearly, that kind of reflection from the past and introspection and letting that past decide current policy and where the country goes was not done. The second point has to do with checks and balances when it comes to acquiring loans. Now, currently in Zambia, there is parliamentary oversight where the parliament consents and approves loans that the government wants to borrow. Now, in 2019, August, the Zambian government embarked on a series of measures, in particular constitutional amendments, in an attempt to remove parliamentary oversight by the legislative body of Zambia. Now, why this is very important to the story of debt is that oversight really improves fiscal responsibility. It ensures that the executive is really making decisions about borrowing sustainably and ensuring that they're made in consultation with the people. But the removal of this type of oversight would leave it open to the executive to borrow as much as it can want to do so. So the reason why Zambia is back in this predicament is that this very last threshold that can help the country to not overborrow has been questioned, has been attacked, and has been challenged. And to a great extent has not been very effective in trying to ensure that the government doesn't overborrow. So the third reason has to do with transparency. And on a majority of loans that Zambia has borrowed, little or no information is given to the general public about what the terms and conditions are of these loans that the government is acquiring. And so that makes it incredibly difficult for parliamentarians, other legislative bodies, activists, and citizens to challenge the government, to hold the government to account, because you cannot hold somebody to account on the basis of information that you don't fully have. But also this lack of transparency rather has caused a lot of friction with bondholders, the majority of whom are European, when it comes to questions that they raise, which the Zambian government is unable to provide on the basis of the loans that they have with China, for example, whose information remains mostly unknown. The final reason of why Zambia is back in this predicament has to do with the lack of strategic investment plans. It is true that when a country borrows, when a person borrows, when a firm borrows, it means they're in a desperate situation. And there's a risk to borrowing, a risk like defaulting, a risk of increased interest payments. All those risks are there. But I think the way that a country and a firm or an organization that borrows can offset these risks is by putting in place very clear plans on how it's going to return that money that it has borrowed, on how it is going to invest that money that it has borrowed to ensure it gets a return on investment, and put measures and plans in case that country defaults. All these plans must be mapped out by an entity that plans to borrow. But in the case of Zambia, there's little evidence that these plans were put in place. Since 2015, the Zambian government pursued unsustainable borrowing plans. The Zambian government borrowed heavily to finance a series of infrastructure projects around the country. So these are, in my view, the main reasons of why Zambia is back in this predicament. You would have noted that in this story, I have not explained Zambia's debt in the image of China, which is what has been done by a lot of journalists. Doing so is doing a disservice to the entire story of Zambia's debt, which is complex and convoluted. At the end of the day, Zambia is its own country with its own sovereignty. And blaming another country for mistakes and policy inaccuracies and missed opportunities does a disservice to dealing with the main problem at hand here. But make no mistake, I am not oblivious to the power and geopolitical influence that a country like China has. And I know that that's a story on its own. But the main takeaway from this topic today is that one country cannot entirely explain why another is in a particular situation. And the main reason why I have not explained Zambia's debt in the scope of China is that too much emphasis on China takes away and distracts from what the main issues are at the core of why Zambia is back in this predicament. But then the question becomes, what is the real impact for defaulting and borrowing over 12 billion US dollars for a country like Zambia? So here are some of the consequences and impacts of the current situation that Zambia is in. Zambia's economy has been projected in 2020 to decline and contract between 3% and 5.1%. To put this in context, this could mean higher unemployment for Zambia, this could mean lower wages for Zambia, this could also mean a reduction in the productivity of the entire economy of the country. And this could mean a significant reduction in expenditure from the state and from the people who make up the economy. And as you know, for an economy to function really well, people need to buy and sell goods and services. And so this has tremendous impact on the state itself, on individuals like you and me, and entrepreneurs, small businesses, and companies countrywide. While it is true that the Zambian economy will contract by the end of 2020, it is not very clear entirely how much of that contraction is directly linked to Zambia's debt mismanagement. As you have well noted, 2020 has truthfully been a very difficult year for many countries given the COVID pandemic and a lot of shocks on industries, domestic industries of countries such as tourism and manufacturing. The other main impact of the current situation that Zambia is in has to do with the foreign exchange reserves, which have dropped drastically. So this has a direct impact on Zambia's main currency, the kwacha. This means that the power and the value of the kwacha has reduced significantly in comparison to the US dollar, which has remained relatively stagnant. What this means in practice for a country like Zambia, which imports a majority of things that it needs to function on a daily basis, is that the cost of importing will drastically increase, thus increasing the cost of goods and services within the economy. And furthermore, Zambia owes about 12 billion US dollars. Now that debt is in US dollars. So what that means, because of the reduction of value and power of the local currency, that debt has become much more expensive than it was when it was borrowed, when the kwacha was significantly well performing in comparison to the US dollar. So that means Zambians will have to pay more of their local currency to return the same amount of debt because of the reduction of power and value in their local currency. There have also been major projections that Zambia's debt will grow beyond 110% of the country's GDP. Now, to put this into context, imagine an individual who owes money to the bank, and the individual makes X amount of money per year. So that individual owes their lender all of their income that they make every year, all of it, plus 10% more. Another major impact has been the classification of Zambia as a country. According to a joint sustainability analysis by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, Zambia has been classified as a high-risk debt distress country. And this was in 2019 before Zambia defaulted on its interest payment. What this means is that it will become incredibly difficult for a country like Zambia to borrow on the world market, given its reputation and what it has been branded. And rankings are very important for things like entrepreneurship and investment. And so a country with high debt distress, as a reputation on its back, is very difficult to attract entrepreneurs, investors, and people who would want to do business with a country like Zambia. The exact extent of the impact of the current situation that Zambia is in is really unknown. But one thing that is very clear for sure is that while it is governments that borrow, the burden of repayment will always fall on the people. Ordinary people, the citizens, the taxpayers, have to pay the debt. And this is because governments tend to have an expiry date in a democracy. But taxpayers and individuals within that economy stay on for generations, and they're left to deal with the consequences that were made by a government. I guess the real question is, does Zambia have strategic, clear, and practical pathways to deal with this current period of uncertainty that has arisen because of Zambia's default on interest payments to its lenders. I guess only time will tell. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Take. And remember to keep yourself updated, learn and get informed by the policies and the politics in your area that may affect your life. Whether these policies are economic, social, or political, they're very important for you to know and be aware of. Just because it's very difficult to deceive a knowledgeable and informed mind. And particularly to young Africans, I think getting informed and claiming your narratives and your voices is incredibly important. Until next time, this was The Take.